Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of Mark My Brain. Today, the issue I want to take a closer look at is this sort of emotional divide in decision making. And in a second, I will tell you how it ties into the question of how important are emotions truly. Because, on one hand, you have so many influential, successful people highlighting the importance of not giving into your immediate feelings, like laziness, cheap dopamine, or fear, right? People like Jocko Willings or David Goggins are prime examples of this grind mindset. In order to achieve results and extraordinary goals, you often have to forfeit how you feel in the moment. And discipline itself, or in itself, is doing things you actively don't want to do or don't feel like doing. So there is this strong notion to abandon your feelings in pursuit of your goals and achievements and similar things. Or at least that's how it feels to me. And it makes sense, right? Because if you gave into every emotion and you'd only do things you feel like doing, you wouldn't be very different from wild beasts, right? But on the other hand, it's also very well documented, and I see that it's talked about a lot as well, is the fact that neglecting your emotions and feelings will inevitably lead to problems in our functioning, typically mental, psychological, or psychosomatic ones, right? So, and those can be very severe with long term impact on our existence, I would say. So, here I arrive at the question of how important are our emotions truly, especially in this sort of decision making decision making context. So, where is the balance? How to recognize when to listen to your emotions and when to overrule them with logic and discipline. Uh, that's something I want to explore today. I think most of us have some instinctive sense of what the answer might be, even though we never actively thought about it. At least I think I do. I feel like I do. Perhaps it's something to do with short term versus long term perspective and short term versus long term gratification. That can be an interesting conversation in itself, but I'm not sure yet. So, anyway, that's the topic I want to focus on today. And let's start with the extreme example from the first camp. I mentioned him, it's David Goggins, who to me represents this sort of philosophy of pushing through. And for those that don't know him, he's a Navy SEAL, ultra athlete, ultra marathon runner, nicknamed toughest man in the world. He did Guinness World Record for most pull-ups in 24 hours, for example, and much more. And what's fascinating is that he wasn't always like this. In his 20s, he used to be lazy, fat, insecure, with no hope, broken, and coming from a childhood full of trauma that held him down. And apart from the insane inspiration that he is, at least for me, is the way that he managed to turn his life around from what I just described to something spectacular and what he is and represents today. And that's by pushing through emotions and immediate feelings to the absolute extreme. As an example, I can give you he ran a 135-mile race on broken feet, literally, and he duct taped his legs and feet so he could finish. And that to me is just insane. But you can see this philosophy, this grind mindset, this philosophy of pushing through, sort of showing, right? And I think that this mindset isn't just about the physical endurance, it's about recognizing that emotions can lie to us. And how we feel in the moment may not actually represent what's best for us or what our hearts truly want. And I would say this resonates heavily with Stoic approach to emotions. They say, recognizing your emotions but not being a slave to them is the sort of key. You are in complete control of your response to your feelings. And oftentimes, for example, like emotional hurt is something we bring onto ourselves, right? You have the typical Stoic quotes like, believe you were not harmed and the harm itself goes away. So we ourselves are often constructors of our own emotions because of something, right? And there's also some recent research that challenges the conventional wisdom that emotional suppression is always harmful. A 2024 study found that expressive suppression can actually induce significant decreases in negative emotion when compared to natural responsive. So there are perfectly good reasons to ignore emotions in certain situations. For example, when they conflict with our values, when they lead to some destructive behavior, I don't know, when they create a paralysis in decision making, or when they are based on outdated and inaccurate information, which actually happens a lot, right? You sort of come to some conclusion about a certain thing without knowing all the facts, without knowing other perspectives, just based on how you feel, right? We as human do this. So this to me, like the David Goggins mindset, the philosophy of pushing through in order to achieve your goals and to achieve something extraordinary, represents this sort of one side of the coin. And on the other hand, or on the other side of the spectrum, lies a very compelling evidence that emotions are not just important, they're essential for optimal human functioning. Emotions have substantial influence on cognitive processes, for example, like perception, attention, learning, memory, reasoning, and problem solving. And those can all be negatively influenced by trauma and slash or emotional damage. Ignoring or suppressing emotions comes with serious consequences, because it's probably no surprise that emotional suppression has been linked to psychosomatic disorders, with research showing, the inverse correlation between suppression and various health outcomes. And long-term emotional neglect can be particularly devastating. Studies, and I would argue even common knowledge nowadays, show that emotional abuse and neglect are linked to a wide range of negative outcomes, including anxiety, depression, substance abuse, or even physical health problems, right? The psychosomatic issues. And as someone who has been dealing with some psychosomatic issues, anxiety and panic attacks, and similar myself, I can sort of testify to this, that this is very real. Also, what was shocking to learn for me was that apparently in some cases, emotional neglect may be more harmful long term than physical or sexual abuse. That is crazy. And from that alone, it doesn't seem like our feelings and emotions are something to be messed with, nor dismissed. And there's also the hedonistic perspective to consider, I would say also. Because from that point of view, emotions are a huge part of the foundation for happiness and well-being, especially in the moment, right? We can probably all agree that hedonistic happiness derived from pleasure, enjoyment, and I don't know, material comforts really does feel pretty good. And even though it can lock you into the hedonistic treadmill of always searching for more, as we discussed in previous episodes, if you want to check it out, it's not something to be easily dismissed either. So now we have mapped both sides of the spectrum. We saw what we can achieve by pushing through the emotions and sort of dismissing them in the moment, but we can also see all the problems and consequences, negative consequences, that can arise from that. And just to showcase that this emotional divide or fight between emotions and logic can be happening simultaneously in the same context, I have also prepared a list of different situations where I'll try to demonstrate that. So, for example, consider scenario number one in career decision. I would say that when you want to trust your emotions and listen to them is if you feel passionate about a particular field or role that, sort of emotionally draws you to it and reflects some of your values and intrinsic motivation. So I would say that's a situation where you want to listen to your emotions. But on the other end, when you perhaps would want to override your emotions, is if a fear of change is preventing you from pursuing better opportunities or again something that you truly want and that truly resonates with you, or if immediate financial anxiety is clouding your long-term career planning and again locking you into a career that you don't want to. I would say in those situations perhaps it's better to override your emotions, right? Example number two, relationships. Again, feelings of genuine connection, love, and compatibility often, provide crucial information about the potential of the relationship, right? You want to listen to those. If you truly feel some connection with someone, you probably want to pursue that because that's one of the highlights of life, I would say. On the other hand, if, for example, anger is driving you towards destructive communication, or if anxiety is causing you to avoid necessary difficult conversations, then I would say again, those are situations that perhaps emotions are serving as an obstacle to a better, healthier relationship. Or example number three, in health and your wellness and well-being, you want to trust your body's emotional signals, because they again often provide important information about stress or burnout or your needs for rest or social connection. And this is something that we talked about. If you ignore it, it can lead to psychosomatic illnesses. But when emotional, for example, eating patterns, you are stressed, so you go to eat. If that, conflicts with your health goals, or if your anxiety prevents you from getting medical care that you need, then I would say perhaps again, your immediate emotions stand in your way of growing and living a healthier, better existence. So as you can see, even in the same context, those, immediate emotions versus this discipline and pursuit of, I don't know, logical or maybe more long-term goals are conflicting. So great. What do we do about this? How can we orient ourselves in this emotional landscape full of paradoxes and contradictions? How do we find the right balance? And here we can start tying this topic together with an Aristotelian perspective I came across and liked. Aristotle offers an interesting point of view on this dilemma. According to Aristotelian virtue ethics, emotions are an original and integral part of moral reasoning and should be an inherent part of moral deliberation or moral discussion. However, true virtue is not the feeling itself, but the appropriate psychological disposition in response to that feeling, the proper response. Do you see how we are sort of coming back to the Stoics with this bit? And then the golden mean principle would suggest that the virtuous response to emotions lies between the extremes, right? Extremes of excess and deficiency. So for anger, for example, this might mean patience rather than either lack of spirit or short temper. Or for fear, it can mean courage rather than either cowardice or rashness. So this is already a framework that can sort of help us orient ourselves, you know, accepting the emotions as they are, recognizing them and their role in some of our moral discussions and discussions we have with ourselves about, for example, purpose in life. However, it is also taking on the responsibility for the proper response. And Aristotelian practical wisdom then involves three key connections with emotions, and that is emotional perception, emotional assessment, and emotional management, which is something that can be sort of commonly understood, I would say. The perception is just perceiving, observing the emotions, and the fact that they provide some moral insight. Again, observing them, accepting them, recognizing them. Then emotional assessment is our ability to judge those emotions, both of our own and other people's as well, and we judge them if they are morally fit or unfit, or at least that's how it's originally in the Aristotelian principles. But here we can already sort of modify it to judge our emotions from different perspective. If they are pushing us in the direction of our long-term goals, if they are helping us become a person who we want to be, or if they are sort of dragging us in the opposite direction, for example. And then the emotional management, that's just knowing what to do to correct adverse emotions and confirm the appropriate ones, right? Listening and acting on the good ones, the ones that we judged are beneficial, and vice versa. And the goal then isn't to eliminate emotions completely, but rather observe them, judge them, and decide our response. I think that makes complete sense. And again, it's something that Stoics probably then drew from also, because it feels very similar in some regards. And this approach also ties into the relationship between emotions and goals. And research on emotion-based goal setting shows that aligning emotions with values and long-term objectives leads to higher motivation and better outcomes. So consider this practical approach. For short-term goals, they may require often overriding the immediate emotional response. For example, again, drawing from the example of David Goggins, he's pushing through discomfort and pain during his training, which provides some personality growth and mental toughness. So in the short term, probably you will need to override your immediate emotional responses. But when it comes to long-term goals, they often benefit from your emotional guidance. Like, again, we talked about like choosing a career that genuinely excites you, that you are passionate about, choosing a partner where you see this long-term genuine connection and love, right? So again, I would say that's something that makes sense to me, because I would say the more animal part of us is sort of more focused on short-term gratification that emotions are often directing us towards. But we as humans sort of sometimes need to rise above those and keep our long-term goals and dreams in mind, right? We don't want to succumb to every single emotional whim that our biology or mind throws at us, again, then we wouldn't be that different from wild animals. So, how important are emotions truly? The answer apparently is both absolutely essential and they sometimes are obstacles to overcome. And the key lies not in choosing one approach over the other, but in developing the wisdom to know which approach serves your highest goals in each situation. And just to clarify, even if you think about David Goggins, the extreme example of the philosophy of pushing through your feelings from when we talked about him in the beginning of the episode, even he has changed his life around because of how he felt. He didn't want to feel like a fat, good for nothing nobody, constantly insecure, living his life out in the gray and never reaching his full potential. And it was because of this core drive to become someone, deep rooted in his existence, that he embarked on the journey to change his life around. So even for him, emotions or feelings played a huge role, right? But I think it's the prime example of what we talked about, long-term versus short-term goals and feelings, right? And I think therein lies one of the greatest takeaways from this episode, at least for me, that emotions can be great for determining your why and your what, your purpose in life, your passions. What do you want to do? What are your values? What do you want to pursue long term? But they are not so great in helping us with the how. In the day-to-day decisions that typically require discipline and offer no immediate reward, they can become obstacles, calling us to laziness, easy solutions, unhealthy habits, and similar. This, I think, is again when the more primitive parts of our biology try to take over, but they can hold us back. Like in a situation where our emotional systems dictate fight or flight response, but we must overcome it in order to grow, thrive, and achieve our goals. And I really like this bullfighter's wisdom I also came across. Quote, "To fight a bull without fear is dangerous and stupid. And to not fight a bull because you have fear is nothing. But to fight a bull with fear, that is something." End quote. And with that, I would bring this episode to an end. Your emotions matter deeply, and so does your capacity to choose how to respond to them. And it can often be confusing, right? You might think you're listening to what your body and mind say, only to find you have in reality been neglecting a big part of you. That happens sometimes and is part of the journey. Being human is difficult. So I wish you good luck on that path. Cultivate your emotional intelligence so you can sort of better orient yourself within your values, your immediate emotional responses, and this whole landscape in order to achieve your dreams and live the best life you can. And I hope this episode has helped you somewhat on that path, brought you some food for thought, some interesting ideas perhaps. And I will be rooting for you. So good luck, and until next time, bye.